As I said last week, today we're looking at two men out of alphabetical order, technically, barely, just barely, but who are worthy of looking at, and I accidentally overlooked them when I was making the new list of people that we're going to be considering. Even though not much is said about them, maybe, compared to some others, the application for some of this, I decided was, especially with Ahaz, definitely worthy of consideration. Ahaz is one of the kings of Judah. He was the 12th king of Judah. He was the son and heir of Jotham. In fact, his name, Ahaz, is the shortened version of Jehoahaz. And sometimes those names are interchangeable in the Old Testament, which can make it confusing for some people, but the deeper you go, you can see that those are the same person. But this quote here says, Ahaz was the worst of all the kings of Judah. He imitated the worst of the Israelite kings, Ahab and Ahaziah. He imitated the worst of the Israelite kings, Ahab and Ahaziah, by a reintroduction of the Baal worship, which had been rooted out of Israel by Jehu and out of Judah by Jehoiada. So Ahaz, not a good guy. He did not do well for God's people. He reigned for 20 years. It says that he pursued religious policy, the religious policy of Jehoram, as was before him, Ahaziah, and Joash. Whenever we read 2 Kings 16, which is where it talks about him, we read that he was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. The numbers can vary a little bit. But the text says he did not do what was right in the eyes of Jehovah his God, as his father David had done. He did not do as his father David had done, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as we said from that quote a second ago. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom Jehovah drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Just a reminder, the high places were inherently sinful. They had a very close connection with idolatry, but also they were supposed to go and offer sacrifices in Jerusalem only. So what we read there in verse 4 is a departure from that. But what struck me with Ahaz wasn't necessarily these things, these more general things. He pursued a sinful religious policy. He was corrupt. He made the people corrupt. He made the religious establishment corrupt. He rejected what David did, as we just read in that verse 2. He went after the idols. But when in chapter 16 here, as it goes down, we read that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem, but Ahaz was being overcome by them. And it says in verse 6, at that time Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elath for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath, and the Edomites came to Elath, where they dwell to this day. But it says what he was going to do was, what he should have done is what any good king would have done, king of Judah would have done when they were surrounded by enemies. What do you think would have been the best thing to do? Pray to who? Yeah, turn to God. Ask God for help. He would be the best person to turn to. But that's not what Ahaz did. Ahaz turned, we see, verse 7, sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, who was the big power at that time, and asked him for help. That was mistake, well, I say mistake number one, maybe not mistake number one, but that was one of the mistakes. He said to him, I'm your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. He took silver and gold from the temple, and he took it from the treasures of the king's house, and he sent a present to the king of Assyria. Please help us. Here's a present, silver and gold and so on. King of Assyria listened to him, marched up against Damascus, saved them, basically. King of Assyria said, okay, because not only did he send me this present, but now they're going to be sort of indebted to us. It's a win-win situation as far as the king of Assyria is concerned. So they do it. And here's the part that struck me. Verse 10. Whoops. Forgot to make that stop doing that, so that's just going to happen a few times. It says, when King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, he saw the altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern, exact in all its details. And Uriah the priest built the altar in accordance with all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz arrived from Damascus. And when the king came from Damascus, the king viewed the altar. Then the king drew near to the altar and went up on it and burned his burnt offerings and his grain offering, and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of his peace offering on the altar. And the bronze altar that was before Jehovah he removed from the front of the house and from the place between his altar and the house of Jehovah, and put it on the north side of his altar. And King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, on the great altar burn the morning burnt offering and the evening grain offering and the king's burnt offering and his grain offering with the burnt offering of all the people of the land. Basically, start using my altar instead. Uriah the priest did all this as King Ahaz commanded. And he did some more things besides all that. But it's interesting. This is a pattern that happens today for a lot of people. And even back then it was happening. So what happened here? Ahaz went to Damascus and he saw the things the way they did things. And okay. Yeah, I don't know if that's a chronological thing or just saying this is the kind of king he was, and then it backs up. Yeah, he wasn't the first to do that, as far as I know, or at least he wasn't the only one. It's that's what they did for Molech. So he adopted that practice of Molech, and so he did that. Pretty sickening, but it would all start. It seems the way this kind of thing would start is he went there and he saw how they did it. He saw their altar. He saw the way they offered things on their altar and so on. And that could have resulted in a couple of things. He could have saw it and been disgusted. He could have saw it and thought, this is not the way God has commanded us to do it. But what he did was he saw it and he thought, I kind of like that. I like this altar. And this seems better than the way we do it. Or whatever kind of influence led him to see somebody else's way and decide, I'm going to replace the way God has told us to do it and start doing it the way they're doing it. And when you look at it that way, that is a very common thing to happen today. whenever we lose sight of this, God has spoken, and this is the way God has said to do it, it shouldn't matter what anybody else is doing. We can't improve on God's system because God's way is always the best. But that's what we're reading. He went and he saw it, and then he adopted it, which meant, that's why I called him, I named him this, the man who went with God, or went with the world instead of God. He went the world's way, do it the way they were doing it. They already had the way that God had told them, but he thought this way was better. And don't people do that today? Musical instruments. How many justifications could we have? It makes the music sound better. Helps us sing. Not all of us can sing very well, and if I heard musical instruments going along with it, it would help me sing better. It's more entertaining. It makes me want to come and worship more. It'll bring more people in. This is the way the young people like it. I mean, the list could just go on and on and on. You see, boy, that's an interesting, neat way of doing it. Let's stop doing it the way we've been doing it and do it the way they're doing it. That's exactly the mistake that Ahaz made. He went, he saw, and he changed. And God wouldn't be too pleased about that, and wasn't, of course. I thought it was interesting how verse 14, it says he moved the bronze altar that was before Jehovah and put it on the north side of his altar. And he even said, the bronze altar shall be for me to inquire by. And it's just interesting, it's called his altar. So now we've got God's altar and we got his altar. And that should never, ever happen. It should never be the case. Dean, did you have something? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. The only criterion, it seems, on King Ahaz's list was, I like it. I mean, that was pretty much it. I like this thing. And he didn't give another thought to anything. Didn't seem to even think about what Jehovah might think or have said. He just liked it, and so he just, that was all. He instantly sent word to Uriah to, immediately get started on this. So that it seems, the text seems to say it was done before he even got back. Because he wanted it. And, like Dean said, some things are not wrong. I mean, there are bounds. I mean, there are limits. And some things, there is plenty of wiggle room for the way a worship assembly could be conducted. And somebody might visit somewhere and they might do something a little bit differently. Like we generally have a few words said before the Lord's Supper. Most places that I have ever worshiped did not do that, do not do that. But once the Lord's Supper is going to begin, the men get up there and then they pray, they pray over it just like we do. They don't have a little, a talk first. But somebody might see that and think, I like that idea. That's a good thing. And maybe submit that to their elders, and they start doing that. Totally fine, because that's not going against any kind of scripture instruction. Same thing with maybe if you do the Lord's Supper before or after the sermon. We used to do it before, and in recent years we switched that to after. we could switch it back to before if we ever wanted to. There's leeway. We're not moving the Lord's Supper to Monday or anything, where it's just before or after the sermon. It's it's within, 30 minutes of each other or so. But what about things that are contrary to the Scriptures? Like they have a woman preacher, or a woman Bible teacher. Maybe we ought to start doing that. Get with the times, Problem is, the New Testament strictly forbids that whole idea. So, has God spoken? Of course, in the Old Testament, with regard to the altar and the temple, he had most certainly spoken very detailed. But Ahaz didn't care about that. All he cared about was, I like his altar. I want to bring that to our place. And that was it. And that certainly would have contributed to some of the sin that took place under his reign. It says also in verse 18, the covered way for the Sabbath that had been built inside the house and the outer entrance for the king, he caused to go around the house of Jehovah because of the king of Assyria. So you see, he was changing things because of the king of Assyria. He was influenced in such a way that he started changing God's pattern. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what it sounds like. Well, I don't know the way he thought of it. He may have thought of it like that, but it seems like what he means by inquire by is in the situations where, like we talked about Ahab and Jehoshaphat, where he was like, well, let's inquire of the Lord first. And whether they had anything to do with the altar and that seems to be the same concept of we need to ask God. So maybe he thought for the regular, the morning, he says pretty much every single offering, the morning burnt offering, the evening grain offering, king's burnt offering, and grain offering, the burnt offering of the people and the grain offering of the people, and their drink offering, and throw on it all the blood of the burnt offerings and all the blood of the sacrifice. So pretty much everything was going to be done on his new altar. But then we'll leave that there for if I ever need to ask Jehovah for help or something, which who knows, it doesn't seem like that would have happened very often, considering he hadn't asked him for help yet. So, but yeah, that's what it sounds like is he means, but he may have thought of it just like the sorcerers, like Balaam, and he may have thought of God like that. Wouldn't have put it past him because he was doing everything else for the other God, so why wouldn't he think about it, the real God, in the idolatrous way? Yeah, he already changed it, changed where it was, changed what it was used for, and replaced it with something that he liked better. And again, that just struck me. It wasn't originally part of the outline based on the book that we've been using, that element of it, but I reread 2 Kings 16, and I was like, wow, that's exactly what so many people do now. They just they get tempted to replace where God has spoken because they like this other way better. Yeah, I'm still doing it for God. Still doing it for God. Aaron in Exodus 32, that was basically when they built that calf, they were still offering to Jehovah because Aaron was very quick to say, tomorrow we proclaim a feast to Jehovah. But did God care that they were doing it for Jehovah? No. He didn't care they were doing it for him. They were doing, as far as God was concerned, they were worshiping that thing they just built. So the way they were looking at it was irrelevant. They were doing something that God said don't do. It didn't matter and we understand that in human relationships. Like, I don't want you to do this, but I'm doing it for you. I don't want you to cut my hair when I fall asleep. Okay, and then they do it, And it's a great travesty. I cannot believe you cut my hair when I fell asleep. I did it for you because I wanted to for you. I wanted to do something for you, but I told you don't do it. It's really that simple. Don't do that, or do this instead. So whenever somebody does the exact thing that you, or the exact opposite, or anything different than what you instructed them to do, it doesn't matter if I was doing it for you. God doesn't care if we're doing it towards him or for him, if it's something that he is not authorized to be done. Yeah. It is so easy to just tell ourselves that he's pleased with it because we're pleased with it. And isn't that tremendously convenient? I'm pleased with it, so God must be pleased with it. That comes from an utter lack of understanding that what God has said matters. Yeah, Dean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It just occurred to me, or I just noticed the language there. I pointed out how the text calls it his altar, but he called it the great altar. You see, the original one that God instructed to be built was called the bronze altar, but he called his new one the great altar. On the great altar, burn all this stuff, do all this. But on the bronze altar, that old one, do that. That to me is very, even though he wasn't doing much on that altar, it's sort of similar to, well, we're going to start having 2 worship services. We're going to have one where we do it the old boring way for all the old people, Then we're going to have another one, that everybody can get on board with, It's just, what is the motive? And do we care more about potentially appealing to young people than we do about pleasing God? Because once we sacrifice God's pleasure for somebody else's pleasure, what is the best outcome? It's not good. The best possible outcome is horrendous. Yeah. He would have said, just worship me somehow. Yeah. Yeah, somebody might say, well, God didn't give them instructions. Your church just made that up. Well, okay, so the New Testament doesn't record where God instructed them to sing, but the apostles did. The apostles, Paul referenced how this is what we do when we gather together. And there's a reason they were doing that, is because they were instructed to do that, and they did. There was a reason they weren't doing any other things, is because they weren't instructed to do those other things. So it stands to reason that this is what they did, so this is what we ought to do, and that is what we believe. And so, whenever somebody might ask you why do you not use musical instruments in worship, the answer should be, in my opinion, the best answer that I know of is, we read that that's what they did in the first century, and so that's what we do. I would guard against saying things like, because it's wrong to use them, or anything that might trigger, just a personal argument or anything. But it's very simple, really. When we read of how they did something, that is gospel, as they say. That is God. That is all we have. It doesn't have to be a thou shalt worship with no musical instruments. We read how Jesus' church did things, and when we read how they did those things, we should do those things. Where we don't read how they did things, then there's a little bit of wiggle room. But if there is something there, that is the most important piece of information, and our feelings and desires should have no bearing on that whatsoever. Yeah, Dean? Yeah. 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 Yeah, there's always been, presumably, well, those are all questions that don't even enter the minds of people. It's just, why can't we change things with the times? One of the problems with that is, depending on what you're using to attract younger people, it may be something that they can get elsewhere. And, why would I need to come here for this? I can get this somewhere else. But there's one thing, if they are instructed and taught properly, that they will realize that they can't get anywhere else, and that's the truth. They can't get the truth anywhere else but God's Word. And I think we have, many people have seen that, if nothing else, there are people, our religious neighbors, that will admit that we care about the Bible more than most of our religious neighbors. We put an emphasis. We actually teach the Bible. It's not all this feely, lovey-dovey, I'm okay, you're okay, stories about, women who lost their husbands and, who all this overcoming and overcoming and overcoming. It's like all these, it's motivational speeches is all it is, that are meant to stir people up emotionally. But what about the Bible? Yeah, Carl?
I use the example in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. It says, "Go therefore and make disciples." The word "go," that's all you needed, because at that time, if he had to list everything of how to go, and he put airplanes in there, and the apostles would be like, "What's in there? What's a blimp?
Yeah.
What's a rocket ship or a scooter?" Because it wasn't there. So you write it generally enough where it's go. It applies to any century. We don't know what's going to be developed in 1,000 years from now, like there's 1,000 years of how they go.
Yeah. But any way that you can go. Yeah.
Whether you're on the back of a donkey or walking by foot or whatever.
Yeah, and that would be an example of pressing it too far. Is somebody said, "What? They didn't have airplanes back then. So why are we sending these preachers overseas on planes to go preach the gospel? Aren't you violating the scriptures? They didn't say you can fly on a plane." Well, they don't have to include every single little amendment. You can use a plane, you can use a car, you can use a scooter, you can use a motorcycle. That would be ridiculous. He just said go, and you could say the same thing about preach the gospel. He didn't say how to preach the gospel either. They didn't have Facebook back then. Why do we have these things on Facebook? You're not supposed to preach the gospel on Facebook. He just said preach the gospel. And so any way that you can preach the gospel is within the bounds of the command to go and preach the gospel. So, very good example.
We would have to use a wheelbarrow to bring this thing in every Sunday.
Yeah, a few wheelbarrows probably. Yeah.
Of thou shalt nots and all the thou shalts.
Yeah, the Bible would be as big as this room.
Yeah.
Because if you had every single every single, this is the thing that's allowed and this thing that's not allowed. But if we understand that when God says do this, it means don't do that, and then we take the words for what they mean, like go and preach the gospel, we'll be okay. Just keep within the bounds of what God has given us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, old bed sheet. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It can be abused. Yeah. And this can be abused. This could be abused. It depends on the way we're using it. We could turn this into a big show, play movies or all kinds of videos and things. And that's not to say that, a video sermon would be wrong instead of me being up there for like, a special occasion or something. But right now, at least, what you see up there is all it is. I've copied and pasted from my Bible app right onto that page. I mean, this is the Bible just as much as this is the Bible. It's the same thing. It's an expediency. Yeah. How long if I wanted to put it up on the board and write it on the chalkboard, I wouldn't even get through as much as I already don't get through. It would be even worse. And today's a perfect example because it's 15 till, and we hadn't even mentioned Andrew. But
in your technology, you could get a congregation that doesn't have a male that can preach, whether it's all females or there's no males that are members yet. And so you could use that to link into, say, here, and your sermon is broadcast, and they participate in the Lord's Supper when we do, and it's so, there's that, again, using technology.
Yeah, to an advantage. In those, it may be rare, but there could be, overseas even, there could be a congregation that has, a few men, maybe enough that they're okay, they're comfortable with leading a prayer. Maybe they could assemble together in theory and do everything exactly the way we do it, except they have to present somebody else's broadcast of a sermon for that period, but then the men there are able to lead a prayer for the Lord's Supper and things like that. That's very possible and totally acceptable. It's not ideal, but it is, within the bounds of what the Scriptures say, working with what they've got. And that's, again, the importance of where God has spoken. Where He hasn't spoken, we can have a back and forth and have a healthy debate about what is allowed and what would be crossing the line. And sometimes the line is very fine, Yeah, but this is where we have Old Testament precedent. See, the manner of worship has changed, but the way God views the worship has not changed. So when we have examples like Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, who just changed a tiny little thing, and God struck them dead instantly. Why did He do that? That's to teach a lesson, that it matters the way we offer worship. And it's so important that, that language there, they offered strange or unauthorized fire. Well, what about when we offer unauthorized music or unauthorized preaching or unauthorized elements of the Lord's Supper? He's not going to strike us dead right now, but what about in the end? He cares. Okay, very quickly, Andrew. It's interesting, or maybe fascinating to think that he's one of the 12, and yet hardly anything is said about him. But he was a disciple of John the Baptizer. His name means manliness, by the way. Andreas. He was a fisherman. Sounds manly to me. But we know he was a disciple of John the Baptizer. He was the brother of Peter. Hard position to be in. We don't know if he was older or younger, I don't think, anyway. But he was the purveyor of a fishing enterprise that he would have inherited from his father, I guess. And it seems like he may already have with his brother. Of course, they gave that up. And they were partners with Zebedee and James and John, he was one of the first, if not the first, of Jesus' disciples, because he is the first one that we read about where Jesus, he was one of the first two that we read about who left John to go with Jesus. And that the text in John 1, a very early, limited part of his ministry that the other three don't mention, seems to suggest they were actually the first two. The other one's unnamed, and it leads us to believe it may have been John himself. But he was then finally an apostle of Jesus. But the thing of his legacy that we're seeing here is he was the first Christian missionary. All because of one place, right after he met Jesus, he went and immediately the first thing that he thought to do was, I need to go get Peter, my brother. I need to go tell Peter. That makes him a missionary right there. He didn't have to go far. You don't have to go over the ocean to be a missionary. And you don't even have to go across the state. He just went home, it seems, or wherever Peter was. And he told him, we have found the Messiah. We found the Christ. And it's such a powerful example that he would not only recognize Jesus to the extent that, that's where Jesus walked by and John said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. But it was just Andrew and this other disciple that as soon as he said that, here they go, they're following Jesus. And Jesus turns around and says, what's going on, guys? What do you need? They said, where are you staying? He said, come and see. And that was all it took. They were with him. And he first, verse 41, found his own brother Simon and said, we found the Messiah, which means the Christ. So they come to find Jesus or meet Jesus and recognized who he was. And the first thing he wanted to do was go tell somebody, and especially his brother. Got to tell my brother, which also says a lot about Peter because it shows that he was someone who would have wanted to know. And probably it shows that he was someone who was looking for the Messiah, just like Andrew was, which is another thing we could have said about Andrew. He was one who was actively longing for the coming of the Messiah. And as soon as he found him, he went after him. But there's that thing that we're talking about here. First missionary, Christian missionary. I say Christian. I added Christian in there because technically we could have considered many of the prophets missionaries in a way. But he was the first Christian missionary by doing that. And even that's kind of loose language. I wouldn't press that too far. But based on, he went to his brother and said, you got to come and meet Jesus. We found the Messiah. And that's an example that we can follow. People always talk about somebody finding Jesus, well, he found Jesus. I think it's probably usually used as a derogatory thing, like almost like an annoyance, like, oh, he's found Jesus. Now he's different. Not in a good way, he's different. He's boring now. He's lame. He's not fun to be around. He's found Jesus. Well, I'm not really a fan of that kind of language of somebody found Jesus, but I know what they mean when they say that. Andrew actually found Jesus in the literal sense, if we want to call it that. Jesus kind of found him, or John found him and showed him. But he wanted to tell somebody and take them to Jesus. And that's how it ought to be for us. We know who Jesus is and what he means for the world and what he can mean for each individual. So we should want to do what Andrew did and go tell. We want other people to have the same thing. Not to mention how he gave up his business and made many sacrifices from his family. It's not mentioned often, but we have every reason really to believe that the apostles' wives and any children they may have had would have been traveling with them too as they followed Jesus. We don't really talk about that element very often, but it's very possible and probably likely that they wouldn't have just left their wives at home and with no support because they weren't working, they weren't fishing, So their families probably would have been with them. So a lot of sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Stephen? James. Okay. Yeah. 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 He still did it his whole life, or at least from the moment he started following Jesus. He was killed prematurely, but still up until his death, he was willing to proclaim his association with Jesus. When we might assume that if he had denounced that, he may have lived longer. He could have maybe given the option of renouncing Jesus to live longer. A lot of people would have taken that, I can repent later, God will forgive me later, of renouncing Jesus to live longer. But he didn't. Yep. And of course, tradition says that all 12, or all but John, were martyred, that would include Andrew. But was that the Columbine one? Yep, that's a very tough spot to be in, and all we can do is pray that we would have the strength to say yes. And if it's true that Andrew and the others were all martyred, obviously they did stand the test, and they know how much it's worth it to withstand that, even though it's awful for other people around you and your families and everything. Better to remain true than to live a few more years without God, or farther away from God at least.